all around. So I'm going to, Kristine and I met at a writing program in Andros in Greece, a place that nurtured both of our books. We met in a workshop room. It's a writing program called Aegean Arts Circle. It's run by a friend of ours, Amalia Melis. And it's a special place where, our vulnerable selves were nurtured. And so, I'm so honored that you're here today, and so honored to have met you in that delicate place where you were, getting the bravery together to voice your story, as was I. So I think what I want to do first is just read a little bit of a description of the book, in case not everyone has had a chance to look at it, and just to ground ourselves in what the story is. And then Kristine will do a reading, and we'll just kind of start our conversation.
You guys hear back here? Yeah. Okay, great.
Good, because I can yell. Kristine S. Ervin was just 8 years old when her mother, Kathy Sue Engel, was abducted from an Oklahoma mall parking lot and violently murdered in an oil field. First there was grief, then the desire to know what happened to her, what she felt in her last terrible moments, and all she was before these acts of violence defined her life. In her mother's absence, Ervin tries to reconstruct a woman she can never fully grasp. From her own memory, from letters she uncovers, and from the stories of other family members. As more information about her mother's death comes to light, Ervin's drive to know her mother only intensifies, winding into her own fraught adolescence. She reckons with contradictions of what a woman is allowed to be, a self beyond the roles of wife, mother, daughter, victim. What a true, quote unquote, true victim is supposed to look like. And finally, how complicated and elusive justice can be. Told fearlessly and poetically, Rabbit Heart weaves together themes of power, gender, and justice into a manifesto of grief and reclamation. Our stories do not need to be simple to be true, and there is power in the telling. Kristine S. Ervin is a creative writing instructor at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. She holds a MFA from NYU, a PhD from the University of Houston, and I'm so pleased to welcome her here with us today.
Thank you, Leslie and Lori and everyone who is here. I mean, this is an incredible, incredible space and incredible company. I just feel grateful and I feel so very honored. So I have so much gratitude in me. I don't know how to contain it. And a wonderful introduction. And yes, the meeting that we had on the island of Andros, there were moments when I was working on difficult subjects and reading my work out loud, and I would look over at Leslie and just feel a connection and feel that this is somebody who heard my story, who could give me feedback on my story, who could push me in directions that I didn't anticipate being pushed with my work. And I will never forget sitting across the table from you in that sacred space and feeling that connection. So I'm just feel so much love and gratitude for you to be here. Yes, everyone. So difficult subject matter. It is a book that is not about rabbits. Normally I would read the section that explains the title, but I'm going to focus on a different section instead because of the conversation that I think will emerge in this space. But to just give you the explanation behind the title, my mother was abducted from the shopping mall, and her body was found about a week later. It took some time to identify the body. I went to my father sometime after her death, and I was 8 years old, and I snuggled up against him on the couch, and I asked him how she died. And I was really asking not so much about the men. I did know that men kidnapped my mother. That was the word I had then. But I wanted the cause of death. I was curious about that. And my father took the approach that he would not lie to his children. And so he was honest and he was direct. And he said, the police don't know. And I asked him why. And he said, because her body had been exposed to elements and had begun to decompose. And I didn't fully understand that at 8 years old. But I did know that a body would become bones. And so I asked how the police knew it was her, because I was holding on to this wish that she was still out there, because I never saw the body. I never had that form of closure. And he said that they identified her through her dental records. And I snuggled a little bit more closely to him, and I asked him, how do you think she died? And he told me the story. He said, I hope she died like a bunny rabbit would. And he started explaining that bunny rabbits, when they're being pursued by a predator, they can get so scared that their hearts stop pumping before anything happens to them. So that was the version that I had of my mother's death until my coming of age, and the evidence destroyed that version. So part of Rabbit Heart is tracing that movement from that not fully innocent, but more innocent death to what I know now. And also what I know now as a woman, having experienced gender violence and patriarchy. So that is the source of the title, this beautiful gift that my father offered me when I was 8 years old, the softness of that gift. And so again, rabbit is metaphor for the mother. And the rabbit shows up multiple times in the memoir as the versions of my mother's death become revised over time. But what I figured I would start off with in the opening chapter, which is titled Woman Gone Missing, I speak about the wonderful offering my father gave to me and my brother, that if we wanted the car back, my mother's car, he would bring it back to the house after the FBI processed it. And we said no, but it was a remarkable gift that he was willing to give us if we needed it. And then right after that, I have this scene. So I figured I would read from this. If you have a copy of the book and you enjoy following along, we were just bonding over some hearing loss, and I tend to like to follow along for that reason. I also have feathers tucked away in my books. So you're going to see me pull feathers out from time to time. So this is going to be the second vignette in the opening chapter, and I'll read it and then we'll have our conversation. Yeah? I've not performed this piece, so good luck to me. Especially with the camera on, I didn't make a wise choice there. My niece Kenzie and I lay in my father's bed, off-white comforter covering our toes, her on the left where my mother once slept, me on the right, my father's side. We were watching Bambi, her first time, though she knew a few lines from the commercial for the newly released DVD. Lines like, "Hurry, the new prince is born," and "Man was in the forest." She curled her body, small at 4 years old, beside me, placing her arm across my stomach, her head to my chest. I wondered if my mother and I had been like this, if she had placed her hand on the top of my head as the doe keeps twitching her ears, sensing what's in the distance. I was 27 when Kenzie and I watched this, me living in Houston with my husband Jerry and working on my PhD. Kenzie kept asking why I wouldn't stay in Oklahoma, where every day could be a day for movies and making chocolate chip cookies, eating spoonfuls of dough as they baked. "You can't go back to Houston," she said. "There are lions and tigers at your house." I didn't know how to explain that after living in New York and then in Houston, I could never return to Oklahoma, even as much as I missed her and Dad and thunderstorms. I didn't know how to say there are tigers in Oklahoma too, some of them living next door. The objects in my father's room, a cedar chest, a macrame planter that hung from the ceiling and held nothing, a crystal box in the shape of a shell, were mostly the same as when Mom was alive, though Dad didn't keep up with the house the way that she would have. Strips of olive green wallpaper, its adhesive deteriorating, were falling, little by little, so that they looked like the peels of half-eaten bananas. I kept thinking, how can Dad sleep like this? where above your head wallpaper seeks to smother you micromillimeters at a time. When Bambi and his mother walk in the meadow, desolate in winter except for a single patch of April grass, I said to Kenzie, "There's a sad part coming up." And she, hearing the music grow more ominous, held on to me more tightly. My brother had felt uneasy about our watching the movie, worrying about the mother's death. "But you let her watch Lion King," I said, where a lion murders his brother, and Snow White, where a man tries to stab Snow White and the witch tries to poison her. And then there's Finding Nemo, where the mother dies in the first minute of the movie. Yeah, but there's something about Bambi that's worse, he said. Kenzie pressed her body even closer, the mother sensing danger and frantically scanning the empty field. We were watching and listening to her panic, her yelling for Bambi not to look back as they ran. I didn't hear my mother then. But then Bambi's in the thicket, snow descending thick and heavy. He's calling out, "Mother," calling out, "Where are you?" calling out, "Mother" again. He's running through the forest, ears flat and back. I know that desperation, and know he'll forever be looking. Kenzie, her body so small next to mine, asked, "Is she dead? Did the mommy die?" "Yes, Goose, the mommy died," I answered, looking over at the chest, my mother's picture lying face down, dust thick like fur. Years ago, the glass cracked, and Dad had planned to replace it. Had it been upright, Kenzie would have seen her grandmother, wearing pearls and a cream sweater with shoulder pads, her hair nearly black into her shoulders, her eyes looking to her right. It's the photograph the police used and displayed on the afternoon and evening news, back when they were searching still. "But what happened?" Kenzie asked. "She was shot by man," I said. Bambi staring up at his father, so tall, so stoic in the snow. I hear my own father say, "Your mother cannot be with you anymore." I see my own head go down. "Is the daddy going to take care of him?" she asked. "Yes, the daddy will take care of him." I kissed Kenzie's forehead. But I didn't say, as perhaps I should have, "The forest is all around you. The meadow isn't a meadow, but a parking lot, a closet, a bed." Or the front yard, where your neighbor watches you lay out in the sun, ice in your lemonade melting. I didn't tell her that sometimes you seek the meadow precisely because man is there, though you aren't sure why. Maybe it's because you've been taught he has exactly what you need, that he's the one who planted the spring grass when you're hungry and thin. Or maybe it's because the meadow is where your mother has been, and you'll do anything it takes to feel close to her again.
Thank you. It's so moving to me, and to hear you speak it with such, vulnerable emotionality is so powerful. And, it brings me to this place of when I was reading your book, it often is seen as sort of true crime and that sort of takes over. But for me, just as what you read, it was really a motherless daughter story. Yeah. And that's what it is for me. It's, it's about what it's like to go through your life without your mother and to lose your mother as a child. And there's been, wonderful, writings and research done. Hope Edelman wrote Motherless Daughters. I know we both read that. Yep. When we were young women, and it's a certain kind of journey to have to shoulder your life without the person who should be exempling and teaching you. Yeah. And we have to teach ourselves, right? And we feel abandoned in that place. And I know for myself, I lost my mother to breast cancer when I was in high school, and so I often couldn't see a life beyond what happened to her. Her disease, her shortened life, that would be mine. I couldn't, we blur her life and ours, and it took me a while to separate this out. What was it like for you? Did you feel really identified with your mother, and how did you hold her throughout your life?
It's interesting, that question, how did you hold her? Because my first response, my response is that I didn't hold her and I wanted to. There was always this intense longing for the mother and to hold her, to feel connected to her, to find her. One of the early chapters in Rabbit Heart is my essentially looking for her in different spaces. I was 8 years old, so I didn't really get to know who my mother was as a woman. I didn't get to know the things that she valued, the spaces that she loved. Leslie, even you, I know that if something were to happen to you and I wanted to feel connected to you, I would go swim in the bay.
Right.
I know that.
And we did.
And we did. You went a bit farther than I did. But growing up, it was, what spaces did my mother love? And I would ask my father and I wouldn't get any answers. He didn't know. So I felt like I didn't hold her. I wanted to. And it became this searching, searching for her in different spaces, being afraid of other spaces, being afraid to return to the mall, for example. Certainly feeling her when I returned to the mall when I was in college for a job interview and walked that parking lot and felt terror. There was a connection there. I imagined her abduction, I imagined her rape, I imagined her murder, all different forms, all of them terrible. And that was a longing and a way to connect and understand. And one of the big questions in Rabbit Heart, which is a difficult question, a scary question for me to put out into the world, is how much did I want violence against my own body at the hands of men as a way to feel connected to my mother? It's a question that really can't be answered, but it's an important question to have. And so it wasn't that in the moment when I was experiencing violence did I feel connected to her, but later when reflecting on that violence and building the connections and thinking of those threads, that I did come to see, a form of holding her in a way that I don't recommend. It's a traumatic type of holding. And I think now that's changed, though. I'm removed from that younger self. And I've had moments with my niece, for example, decorating Christmas ornaments when she was young. And I felt my mother in those moments with paint on my fingertips because we used to decorate Christmas ornaments together or making the chocolate chip cookies. I've had some moments like that of connection where I feel I can hold her. But that happened later in my life than it did in my adolescence. Adolescence was so defined by thoughts of violence and by violence against my body and by, being in the company of men. I mean, this space is amazing to me because of all the women who are here. I didn't come to appreciate women until much later in my life. So I was surrounded by men growing up and being squeezed from all different angles, honestly. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I answered the question okay.
Yeah, you did. And I feel like it resonates for me because motherless daughters, usually we have to create our mother.
Yeah.
And we have to create the connection and we have to keep building that relationship over time. And that's what you're sharing. You kept building your relationship and creating it with your mother sometimes through this portal of sexual assault.
Yeah.
And, I know myself when I go, my mother died of breast cancer. I felt that specter over me. When I go in for scans, I feel close to her. I no longer feel like it's my inevitability, but I do feel like scans are a place where I feel her, where she visits me, And so I think that's so honest and beautiful for you to talk about this, grave, this trespass, this rape, sexual assault that you experienced, that your mother experienced. And there is this shocking, beautiful way that it illuminates your mother and you together. But that's just one place in the journey, in the evolution, right? This book is also such a deep feminist book, where you take on the patriarchy, you take on all the everyday assaults of violence that are all around us, the ordinary ways that we are violated as women in the society, and you take that on and you call that out, and even when even when it surfaces in your own father. You know,
Yes.
when you're sharing with him, this happened to me, the neighbor did this to me, and your father, or the doctor did this to me, the teacher did this to me, and your father sort of downplayed it,
Yes.
right? And what was that like for you when he suddenly, was that shocking in the moment? Like, he's going to have my back, right? I'm telling him, I'm crying, I'm telling him how I was violated, and he kind of doesn't get it.
Yeah. May I pause before answering that and read from your memoir?
Sure.
So I'm going
I
to go
knew
back.
you were going to do this.
I'm going to just go back to what you were saying previously in terms of the connection that you feel with your mother when you're going in for screenings, because you have this amazing moment in your memoir. If you don't mind, and if this is too much, Leslie, then you can shut me up. But thinking about when your mother dies, and this is page 48, if anybody has the book in front of you. But you say there would be no more hospital visits, no more talks at the kitchen table or in the car after chemo appointments. 1,000 unspeakable words rose up in my throat, words I couldn't yet reach, words I would spend the rest of my life forming and unforming. And I just think that resonates with what you were talking about in terms of, you know, when you go to these scans and you feel your mother in this way, that's part of the unspeakable. That's part of the forming and unforming and the continued dialogue. And it's not as we wish it to be, but it's what we have. And this moment resonated
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
As did other moments when you have with your father. And so with my father, that to answer your question, when I went to my father as an adolescent and said, you know, Doctor, what did I name him in the memoir? I had to change his name. I swapped out abusers, by the way. So it was a nice little trick. I needed to change names. But, you know, so you just kind of take that name over there that you know and that name over there, different circumstance. So Dr. Walcott, as he's named in the book, when I started being a teenager and going to my family doctor, he's the one who delivered me. He's my family doctor. He would keep asking me about kissing boys. Do I like kissing boys? And it was making me uncomfortable. And I went to my father and I said, he's making me uncomfortable. And he said, oh, he's just joking with you. And then there was a time I went in and I was in high school and there was a thermometer. I'd taken my temperature. I set it on the table in front of my legs. And when he came in, he said, is that an in-between-the-legs thermometer? You know, and I went to my father with this. He said, well, isn't there always a nurse in the room with you? And I said, no. He said, oh, well, that's why I thought he was joking with you. And I said, what am I supposed to do with this? He said, well, you know, you could just go see another doctor. Well, to an adolescent girl, I was thinking, well, if he sees me in the practice and I'm going to another doctor, then Dr. Walcott's going to ask me why I'm going to another doctor, and then I'm going to have to explain. And you start doing this spiraling, right? And this protection of the man. And so in the moment, no, there was no, my father's not protecting me. There was no, like, there should be another answer here because I was a child. And this is my parent, and I'm listening to my parent. It's only later in womanhood, looking back, that I think, oh, this is all problematic. And all these moments that I had, you know, my neighbors, for example, as an adolescent, I thought I had agency. I thought I was mature. I thought I put on a performance of an adult woman, even though I was a 17-year-old. And then later I find out that no, these neighbors considered me to be vulnerable. That was the word that they used. So then you start reframing it. Recalibration was the word we used the other day. So it's then in womanhood and adulthood when I went to my father and Rabbit Heart was getting closer to happening, and I had a conversation about my experiences with the neighbors. And he essentially did what the patriarchy does and blamed me, more or less, and for what I wore, for how I acted. He was disappointed in me, not angry with the next door neighbors. And that adult self is coming from it at a very different angle. So yes, the adult self now feels disappointment and my father for not protecting me, while also holding at the same time, this is a man who woke up to police officers on his front porch and was a single father, like this, and had to raise a daughter completely on his own with really no resources, no support. And he did the absolute best that he could. Was it flawed? Absolutely. Is he a member of the patriarchy? Definitely. But he loves me. And so as the adult, I hold all of that at once, that yes, he got things wrong, but he also loves me deeply and loved me deeply then. And he didn't have the answers and I didn't have the answers. And we both did the best that we could.
And that's that sort of adult, wise kind of place of compassion that I think memoir allows us to arrive at if we stay with it, if we right into those dark places, if we ask the questions, if we're honest with ourselves. This is such a beautiful, brave, and honest book. And one of the many things that I was so moved by was, speaking of your father, he was a character I was very fond of. And even though he'd let me down in these moments that were your lived experience, but one of the things that was so profoundly impressive to me was the way you kept pushing him to know you. It wasn't just that you were calling him out and raging. You wanted him to understand, this is pain that I had. This is what I experienced. I want to be close to you.
Yeah.
And you, I sort of marvel at that. I mean, I did my best with my father to kind of push him to see me. We want to be seen. But I feel like you did that so many times through so many conversations with him that are, described in the book. And did that feel like that brought you to a closer place between the two of you?
I still don't feel seen, and he's read Rabbit Heart, and even after reading it, I don't necessarily feel seen. I don't think I can feel seen with my brother or with my father, just because I think we're very different people. They don't understand my need to write the story. They don't understand my need to put the story out there in a public way and to connect with other readers. There's so much silence on the male side of my family, and that's part of patriarchy too, right? Teaching men to be silent about these things. And yet, what a gift, really, that I did have those conversations. I did have those attempts, and I think my father understands me more than my brother does because I've had those conversations with my father, those moments where I did go to him with different experiences. He has asked me questions about the writing, and I was always comfortable going to him with questions about my mother. Who was she? And, why didn't she breastfeed? Now, his answer was not, I think, the truth. It was a answer that, well, I don't know. Maybe she didn't breastfeed because she thought her breasts were too small. Yeah, and I thought, I don't know that would be her answer. It may be more to do with it was the 70s and they were pushing formula, and that might be a bigger factor here. But he at least, while I may not ever feel fully understood or fully seen, he was still open to my asking questions. He may not have always had the answer. He may not have always had an answer that I liked. He may not have always had the answer that was helpful or true, but he was open to the conversation. And I certainly didn't go to him with all of my pain. He had no idea everything I was going through. I was very good, I was very good at putting on a performance, and that includes for my father. And when Rabbit Heart came out and I took it to him when I had my author's copy, and I saw him hold her, I call her a her, hold her to his chest. We had a conversation about whether or not he should read it. And I said, you are going to read my pain in a way that I never showed you my pain when I was young. And I think that will be difficult for you because I did not go to him with everything. And that's where it's not his fault either. He didn't have the tools, and he didn't have a daughter who was forthcoming about a lot of experiences. So I hope that I have written him compassionately. I worry about that. We worry about how we represent the people who matter to us. Did I get the balance right? I mean, as writers, even though the book is done, you still think about your writing and you still question it and you worry about it, especially when, particular reviewers may interpret it a certain way, particular readers may interpret it a certain way, but it helps when I hear someone like you saying, no, I was fond of the father because I'm fond of him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that comes across so clearly in the way that you just capture his speech and in the way you describe the sacrifices he made as a father.
So many sacrifices.
I mean, he stayed in the family home and didn't get promotions and jobs elsewhere to keep this kind of constant place that would nurture you and your brother, and I think he also didn't remarry. I mean, he had a partner for a while or a girlfriend for a while, but then he kind of closed that door. He did what he could in his own kind of language and colloquial culture to be both parents. And, that's just one paragraph in your book. But I remember when I got to that paragraph, wow, his gift and his trying to nurture you really deepened.
And there was an awareness, too, of just the impossibility. So he remembers my dance recital in 3rd grade. So basically a year after my mother died, a year to 2 years, I started taking dance. I was not that great, but the dance recital. And at the dance recital, all the girls had their mothers back in the room. The makeup and the hair and the feathers and the pantyhose and extra pantyhose. And that was a traumatic experience for me because all the girls, my perception is, but my girlfriends at least, my classmates, they all had their mothers. And my father stood in the doorway of this space and remembers he's not really supposed to be in that space. He knows that I'm hurting. He can't be there in this way. And I went home after that dance recital and I didn't eat my cake and I went to my bedroom and I cried and I never danced again in that way. And he remembers this as there is nothing I could do for you. There's nothing I could do in that moment to make it better. And it still hurts him to this day. But these gifts, so we stayed in my childhood home. He read that for adults who are undergoing trauma, it's better to make major changes, change houses, change jobs, change cities, get away from it. But for children, stability is best. So my mother's needlepoint stayed on the walls, those objects in the room deteriorating, but still my mother's objects. And I felt held by that house. I still love that house. I still go back to Oklahoma and I visit it and I take leaves off of my maple trees and, it's not my home anymore, but I still go and honor it. And that's something my father gave me, was that feeling of being held by a house that I loved and a house where I remembered my mother. Yeah.
And so he kind of kept intact what he could keep intact.
What he could keep intact.
And that's profound.
Yeah.
And I read it as a lot of self-sacrifice on his part.
So much
putting
sacrifice.
you and your brother first.
Yes.
In a very decisive, profound way.
Absolutely.
In the way he could. He was loving in this way to you.
Yes.
I want to sort of turn a little bit to memoir writing. We have a lot of memoir writers in the room here, people who are working on their own projects, and it connects with your father and what we're talking about, because it seems so clear to me that in the writing, and you worked on this book for 20 years, so you grew and evolved.
It's a long journey.
Many selves. I know, it feels embarring, doesn't it? How long did you work on this, Leslie? 17 years.
I win at 20.
Yeah, you do. You grew 3 more selves than me that wrote this book. But, writing and rewriting our story and living into different parts of our lives really allows us to, come into new understandings and insights. And that's why I think your relationship with your father does come across as so loving. What was the journey of writing? How did memoir writing over such a long time change the story?
It's been such a long journey. I could spend probably 20 hours talking about just this question. I think I'll let people know where it began, where I think of its beginning, which was in middle school when I wrote my first poem, and it was about my mother's death. And I think it was born out of this need to shape and to have control over a story. A poem is lovely that way because it's distilled, you have the line breaks, you have the white space, and even though I didn't understand all of that at 13, I had my terrible rhyme scheme. It gives you something to hold on to when the content is so difficult. But I needed to get it out of my body in this way, and I needed, again, kind of gain agency over her death and over the story. And I continued that. So in my undergrad, it was poetry. In my graduate at NYU, it was poetry. And it was wonderful in poems because I could just take singular aspects of her death. When I found out about that decomposed, really means that her body was eaten by animals. I mean, when I came across that detail, I took to a poem with nice lines and controlled the emotion that way and crafted it. And putting it on the page was brutal, but the crafting of it, the shaping of it, making those decisions about the form, about the language, about the metaphor, that's where I gained some distance. But with poetry, I was able to just take those like singular aspects, right? And that was what I needed at the time. And then for my PhD at the time at the University of Houston, when you entered either as a poet or as a poet, you had to take a crossover workshop, which means that you had to take either a fiction workshop or a nonfiction workshop. And my schedule was such that I took a nonfiction workshop with Ruben Martinez, amazing author, writer of several books about the desert, about the border. And he has a background in journalism. And he said in his classroom, you need to go to the text. And what he meant by that was research. So you take your story, but now you add in the element of research. And it starts growing the story outward, where, tentacles or ripples or however you want to think about it, it becomes not just your story, but a broader story. And that's what memoir began to offer me, that it's not just Shepherd Mall as I know the mall, but Shepherd Mall and what it meant to Oklahoma as the first mall in the state, what it meant to other women who would not return to that mall, what it meant to people in Oklahoma after the Murrah building bombing when the state offices and federal offices were moved to the mall. Suddenly now this space isn't only about my violence, about other violences too. And that's where the growth really started happening, was when I realized this isn't only my story. This is a broader story. I had no idea, though, that Rabbit Heart was going to be so much about power and so much about patriarchy. That's what the journey has really been over the years. Started off my mother's death, my experience with grief, very particular type of grief. But through my getting into adulthood and being able to reflect back, and then rereading what I wrote and thinking, wow, there's a lot about power and gender here, that if I had finished this book 15 years ago, that would not have really been a major element because I hadn't grown into that space myself yet.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think that's what memoir can offer us. The trick with memoir, many tricks. One difficulty is, how do you know when it's over? Because I could keep writing this and I would have more layers as I gain more experiences. And that's, how do you know? How do you know when it's done? How do you know when this is the story and you don't need to continually add to it or think of it differently?
Right, it's never done.
Yeah?
It's never done, but you can done it. And you can feel like you've come to the close of something,
And you have to have an understanding through distance and through other readers, right? Through sharing it with some readers that you trust who can give you feedback. I think you need to arrive at an understanding of what the story is. And then once you do that, then it becomes easier to see this is when it's done. Mm-hmm. But for me, it took a long time for me to see what the story needed to be. And it was also complicated that we got a DNA match 23 years after my mother's murder. So the first draft of Rabbit Heart was my dissertation, and it didn't even have this title. And it was a collection of essays about grief, comparing the sudden loss of my mother with the slow deterioration and losing of my father. Once we got the DNA match and we went into the judicial process, that changed the entire scope. Now I have a narrative arc. You know, there's a resolution to the case. There's a death, another character. I have more information now about her death than what I had before. And it took me a long time to figure out what she needed to be now that I had this story that I didn't come of age with. So
the story kept arriving.
It kept
changing,
arriving.
kept pulling you along.
Yeah, it was
right?
super annoying.
Yeah, right. I'm done with this.
Yes.
No,
you're not. No, here's the curveball.
Right. Many curveballs in this
Yeah.
book, and but I'm so interested in that feminist journey for you, because when we talked on the phone, you said, "Oh, I used to be, skeptical of feminism."
Yes.
And arm's length, and
Oh, definitely.
You say you're like kind of male identified, and energy from men, and that was kind of how you situated yourself. And then this book is not like that. This is a powerful book about feminist and reclamation of women's power, your mothers and yourself. Was that just kind of like you getting the story retelling itself over and over again, and you coming into your own power?
I think coming into my own power. So I recently had a conversation with my mentor from undergrad, Lisa Lewis, poet, kick-ass feminist, terrified me at 19 years old. I took her workshops, and she pushed me hard in wonderful ways, scary ways. And I remember, so the poem with the animals, for example, I turned that in her class, and I had the metaphor where truth was male. So truth exposes himself and all those dirty parts of his. And I also wrote a poem where I was longing for my own body to be abducted and raped as a way for me to finally have answers and to finally know what she experienced, so I didn't keep questioning that. But then also as a way for me to feel connected to my mother and to her body. And I remember Lisa, with these poems that I was writing, she said to me, "You are the poster child for feminism." And I thought, oh, hell no. And I imagined, I had this very clear, distinct image of a billboard. And I was on the billboard with a bunch of women. It's like, no. Because I think often young women feel this way, but it was also amplified for me because I grew up with two men. I didn't have women around me. I didn't have female, family members who were very present. And I felt very comfortable in the company of men. I'm not going to say I felt safe. Those are not the same thing. But I felt comfortable in a room full of men because I could define myself against them. I was the object. I did not hold the position of subject. I felt very comfortable in the space of being object and saying, I am not that. I am defining myself against men. And participating in that. And again, feeling comfortable because that's what I knew. So to think of me on a billboard with women, who am I supposed to be there? Who am I if I can't define myself against something else? But yes, I think it's just coming into my own power as a woman, but then also finally entering communities of women, like with you, like in Andros, friends of mine, my pseudo-mom, and just coming to embrace and be embraced by women allowed me to become more comfortable and occupy a position of subjectivity rather than being the object, and showing me that being the object is very problematic and not healthy and doesn't lead to anything that is good.
Right.
And through that, I think I was able to push into those spaces that are very uncomfortable in Rabbit Heart, where I feel vulnerable, where I am asking those questions. Okay, I'm 17. I'm getting into sexual relationships with my next door neighbors who are in their 30s, thinking that I had agency, thinking that I wanted that, but my body knew otherwise. My body suffered trauma, especially in some of the violent moments, and thinking that, again, that kind of being object is not, my body knew that that wasn't okay. Coming into that power then has to reckon with those experiences. And I think that reckoning with those experiences and thinking about, okay, this is how my experience with the neighbors is now connected to other forms of gendered violence, is also connected to what happened to my mother, it's also connected to my father's response over here. That's when it became the deeply feminist book, is when, again, kind of rippling outward and seeing those connections with the broader culture.
Mm-hmm. And the subjectivity, I'm a subject.
I am a subject.
What if I defined everything that's happened to me and is happening through my own experience?
Yeah.
What if I am the subject of my life, right?
Yeah.
And then all the frames change.
It does.
And memoir is about that. What am I? What am I feeling? Who am I right now?
And the claiming of the voice, the claiming of the story. I was speaking earlier about, every now and then I'm lucky enough to teach a class that I designed that's called Breaking Silences, Memoir as an Act of Rebellion. And what I love about this class, it's primarily women who take it, not always, but the students have to break a silence of some form. And this can be a personal silence, it can be a cultural silence. They create a work of art of any medium where they are breaking a silence. And to bear witness to their subjectivity, to bear witness to their claiming their voices and their stories, sometimes for the first time, it's just magnificent. It's magical, it's empowering, it's powerful. I also take those stories home with me, so it's exhausting and, and I feel them deeply, but I think it's just truly remarkable when we finally claim our stories and say they matter, and not only do they matter to us, but then potentially they can matter to someone else if we put that story out there.
Right. They can lead to transformations with other people, and that's just brilliant. I feel like I have one more question, and then I want to open it up to questions that
It's
you
so
all may
scary,
have.
by the way, being the one that's answering all the questions.
You're doing great. You're doing great. This is fascinating.
I'm just looking at your mermaid earrings.
Yeah. Where are my mermaid earrings? So it's a mother lost daughter, a motherless daughter book for me. It's a book about coming into agency, honoring complexity of your life and your mother, and coming into voice in an honoring way. This book is probably often getting compared to or put into the genre of true crime, right? And we've talked about that. And so, there was a wonderful essay that was out recently in Slate magazine by Lily Danziger about the difficulties of writing about murder and violence in a way that's honoring and that's in a way that's not exploitative. And did you have any awareness of true crime when you were writing this? Did you read or watch true crime? How did you keep that voice low while you were working?
I really have a non-answer when it comes to true crime, because I have not engaged much in the genre, whether it's in written form or its visual form. I did read James Ellroy's My Dark Places, a book that I detest. I think that it perpetuates violence. I think the voice on that page relishes in violence against women in a way that I just find deeply disturbing and does not move the culture forward in a way that is helpful. But I went to that memoir when I was, after my master's, starting my PhD, and I was grappling with whether or not I wanted to look at the case file in my mother's case. Because it's exhausting not having answers and imagining 1,000 different scenarios, most of which are terrible. And I thought, well, maybe if I just go through the case file and I see photographs of her body and I see the evidence, maybe I will arrive at some form of closure. And James Ellroy, his mother was murdered when he was 10. And he came, he's a true crime writer, LA Confidential, this huge name. And he wrote My Dark Places about his reworking his own mother's case after he was an adult. So I went to that text not from I'm going to read true crime, but here is somebody who may have a similar experience and I want answers. And instead I ended up hurling the book across the room and launching it against the wall because I was so angry with it. And there have been a couple other memoirs, so Fact of a Body by Alex Marzano-Lesnovich, Red Parts by Maggie Nelson. Those are books that I think handle the telling of crime very, very well and ethically, where other texts do not. I don't think of Rabbit Heart as a true crime story. I think, yes, it traces the developments in the case, but only in that I am putting on the page the versions of the death that I had to reckon with growing up. So I see this as a grief memoir, motherless daughter's memoir, a memoir that is meant to show what 25 years of unrelenting, brutal grief looks like when you are the loved one of a victim and you don't have answers. So any case details, any evidence details, they are not there for the purpose of showing a crime. They are there for the purpose of showing what it is like to constantly have a death of a loved one revised and revised again and revised again, each time getting more violent and more removed from that bunny rabbit. So, it is getting shelved in true crime, and I don't know how I feel about that. It has a broader audience. Maybe Rabbit Heart can reach that audience and get them to think about true crime in a different way and perhaps not participate in it in nearly the same way. But what I am deeply concerned about, and I've always been concerned about with this subject, is does my writing, especially the violence, the sexual violence, does it perpetuate the very thing that I am trying to undermine and dismantle? I think James Ellroy's text perpetuates it. I don't think it dismantles gender violence. I think it participates in gender violence. And I don't know that I have an answer. I can just hope that I treated it with complexity and nuance and compassion for victims and in such a way that it is not, again, perpetuating the thing that I'm sick of, which is violence. And so much of true crime, I think, glorifies, turns it into entertainment, and I'm not okay with that.
Yeah, I don't. You failed at that.
Good.
It's a deep honoring of the complexity of losing a mother in this, radically violent way, and it's an honoring. It's an honoring of her complex life, not just the way she died, but her complex life, and it's an honoring of your journey with your family and yourself. And so, that's very clear to me. So it's beautiful and brave and honest, and I'm so...
As is yours.
And I'm so, moved to be able to talk to you about it.